Yeah,
All right.
okay.
Today is August 11th. My name is Chelsea Lee, and I'm here with Miss Millie Chan, and we will be conducting a full-length interview. So thank you so much for being here today, and let's get started. So the first couple of questions will be about your early life. Where and when were you born?
I was born in San Antonio, Texas, March the 11th, 1933. It's a long time ago.
Yeah.
Yeah,
How would you describe the household and neighborhood you grew up in?
well, actually, my parents were business people and they owned grocery stores and restaurants. And when I was little, it was mostly grocery stores, which was in walking distance from the house. And we lived on a street that was not paved. So it was kind of dirt um, street. And many of my father's relatives from China came to work in the various businesses. So there were a lot of young adults around, many, well, I would say 4 or 5 men, young men. And then my mother was the eldest of 10 children. Actually, we've discovered it was more than that. But her sisters, she had many sisters. She usually came to work in the businesses as well. So there were a lot of young adults around, both male and female. And then during the Second World War, many of the Chinese pilots came to train in San Antonio because the weather there is perfect for airplanes. So there were a lot of young military men around. So that was my early childhood. Then when I was a young teenager and I was a middle of 3 girls. I had an older sister who was named Barbara, and she was about maybe 2 years and 3 months older than myself. And then I had a younger sister who was 5 years younger than I was. And when we were young teenagers, we moved to a very big house, a stone house in a very nice part of San Antonio, called on Mulberry Street. And we lived there until I married Lo Yi. And my mother actually lived there until she died. And then my sister lived there until she died recently, about 2 years ago. And this house was very close to Trinity University. So I think my sister went to Trinity. I started to go to Trinity as well, but then I ended up at Our Lady of the Lake and I studied music because I started the violin at age 5. And so I was playing the violin and I played it in college as well. So I studied music education is what I studied.
Right. Yeah. So you mentioned that your parents ran a grocery store when you were younger, and a Chinese restaurant as well. Did you have to help out and in either of these businesses? And how did this experience shape your childhood?
Okay. Um, we did have to help out. Not a lot, but on occasion we would have to be cashiers. And the experience shaped, well, first of all, I love to watch people doing things, ordinary things. So it was watching the butchers carve, carcasses and meat and steaks and stuff that was going to be sold. So I was very interested in the technique in which they cut up the meat, and so I learned to do that, and that helped me later on in my life when I taught cooking. So that it sort of got together. Um, then when my brother was born, who's 13 years younger than I am, and after having 3 daughters, of course, an Asian family, to have a son was really a big event. So my father opened a very large restaurant in San Antonio called Tai Shan. And it became very popular and was well known. So that's what happened there. We worked, none of us really worked in the restaurant. My mother ran it. My father also was involved. And this restaurant recently, yeah, the restaurant recently was going to be sold because it was bought by a community organization called, I don't even remember what it was called, but it was a big celebration of San Antonio, and there were lots of floats. There would be a big parade and people would be all dressed up, etc. And so their early life was written up, and I think I sent it to you recently by some historians in San Antonio. So my parents were very well known, particularly my mother, who was very outgoing. She was born in Arizona 9 years before it was a state. And she was the first of, as I said, 10 children. We now have a cousin who is a genealogist, and we found out that my grandparents had many more children than that, like 14 and 15. I can't believe. But they immigrated to Arizona in the late 1800s and lived there. And when we were young, we would travel by car to Arizona from San Antonio, which took several days in those days. So that was sort of our early life. It was very varied. There were lots of people around, a lot of, I failed to mention, which was very important in my life, was young, the male relatives from the village would cook every evening Chinese meals. And because everybody worked late, they all came to dinner at our house. And so there were like 15, 20 people at dinner every night. And I watched the young cooks cook. And that, of course, that interested me. Our early life, my sisters and I were taken care of by a Mexican nursemaid who didn't like to cook. So this was an opportunity to learn to cook and just to, be in the kitchen and watch what was going on. Yeah.
So, how was it like being growing up as an Asian American in San Antonio? Were there other Chinese families around during that time?
Yes, there were. As a matter of fact, San Antonio had a rather large Chinese population there. And so, as a young person, we went to high school. There were young Chinese in the high school, and early on we would date and so forth. And my mother was very outgoing. She was very well known. We did not feel discriminated against because she was so accepted. Our parents were so accepted in the community. My father was a Rotarian. My mother was a Rotary Ann, which is the women's part of that organization. And, we belonged to church and many other organizations. So they were well known in the community. And I think that really made a big impression as far as, being Chinese was not looked upon as anything negative in any case. In fact, this is one very interesting incident. During the 1940s, I think it was, the supermarket chain wanted to pass a bill in the state legislature to forbid foreigners to own property. And my mother went to, was testified at the state legislature. And she testified in such a way that she was written up in the newspaper. In fact, I have her her whole incident was written up because I should have gotten this out before I thought would be. In any case, written up as to what she wore, what she said, and because she was so adamant and everybody looked up to her, the bill was not passed. And they credit her with having been the person to actually negate that bill. So that's very important, I think, during the early days of San Antonio, and particularly for the Asians, where there was a large Asian community. And as a young kid growing up, we had a lot of Asian friends, Chinese friends, and so on. In fact, I married at the age of 18 to a Chinese fighter pilot of the Second World War. He was a lot older than me. And three months after we were married, he re-enlisted or was told to go back to flying, and he was flying in Korea, and he flew into a mountain. So he was killed. And so I hadn't finished college. After that, I went back to school, finished college. And that was before I met my present husband, Lo Chan, who I met when we both were in our early 20s. And he was studying architecture at Harvard. And he also had a somewhat sad love affair, in that the woman that he was interested in told him she was going to marry somebody else. So he went off and decided to join the Army, which he did. And of course, San Antonio was a big Army base for Air Force and Army, etc. So the first thing he did was to apply for a transfer. He didn't want to go to Texas, tried for a transfer. And then my future brother-in-law and he, who was also Chinese and from Hong Kong, was also an architect. Bill, my future brother-in-law, brought my husband, Lo Yi, to a restaurant, and my mother, of course, invited them to Thanksgiving dinner. So that's how we met. And then, of course, he was shipped off to Europe. He wanted to go to Europe, so he was in Germany for about a year. After we actually got engaged, and he went off to Europe for a year to, I'm losing my mind, I can't remember. In any case, he was there for a year, and then when he came back, we got married, and we moved up to Cambridge, Massachusetts, where he finished his schooling. And that's where I was working for the Harvard Press. He was going to school. And then we had our first child, Chris, in 1957. I know we were married in 57. Chris was born in 58. And yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna ask, so back to, so I realized that the San Antonio Chinese community has some very well-known grocers. There's someone named Rose Wu.
That's my mother.
Oh, wow, yeah, so Yeah. And there's other grocers such as Jane's G.
Uh-huh.
And do you know of these
Oh
families?
yeah, they were friends. We were all friendly because, there's a small, it wasn't that small, but of course we were Chinese. We all knew each other and we all had events together and knew each other socially as well as, in other words. So it's a close community, really.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You also mentioned earlier that you attended Our Lady of the Lake College for music education.
Uh-huh.
What made you choose this major?
Well, as I said, I started the violin at age 5. So I played the violin through college. And I had gone to Trinity at one point, but then decided, I don't know, remember why, but I decided to transfer to Our Lady of the Lake. And that's where I finished my education. I think because, frankly, although I started violin and music very early, uh, I didn't think I had really great potential. My ear wasn't that fine, uh, but I loved the violin, and music is one of the things that I enjoy most now. Actually, my husband and I were very avid goers to the Chamber Music Society and so forth here in New York City. Yeah.
Yeah. When you said you were going to major in music education, did your parents have any opinions on this decision or any thoughts from that?
Actually, no, they were very liberal. I mean, my mother actually found a music teacher for us, and that's how I started at the age of 5 with the violin. She wasn't a great teacher. She didn't really give me a good background in technique and so forth. So I felt I lacked that continuing on. And I played, the violin in college and did recitals and so forth. But I didn't ever, wasn't really I loved it, but not to the extent that I thought I could do it professionally. Let me put it that way. Yeah. I was actually much more interested in being a mother. So that was a great motivation for me when I married and had 3 children. Yeah.
Um, so um, you married in your husband in 1957,
Uh-huh.
and you mentioned that you guys met through I think it was your brother bringing him over,
Oh, well, it was my future brother-in-law.
future brother-in-law.
Yeah,
Um,
he married my younger sister, and they, after they married, they went to Hong Kong and lived in Hong Kong.
I see. Oh, I'm so sorry. Um, and so I'm sorry about that. So what was your dating experience like if you had one?
Oh, we dated very early in Texas. First of all, everybody learned to drive, everybody had their own car. So dating was an easy thing. And frankly, I had a lot of different boyfriends at that time because, you know, uh, everybody was interested in going out and being together. Things that we had things like bowling clubs in which people would get together. Um, and I did that when I was younger. I was more sociable than my sister, actually, older sister. And my younger sister was so much younger, we didn't really intersect that much uh, socially. But so that's what it was like. It was a very close community. It was a lot of fun. I remember talking to my friends for hours on the phone. In those days, we didn't have iPhones, but we did have a telephone, so we talked a long time. And there was always a lot of gossip and things we talked about. So it was fun. Yeah.
So when did you decide on marriage, and how did you know it was the right decision for you at the time?
Oh, that's a very interesting thing. Loie was not because I had gone out with so many boys and men when I was younger, and they were all from Texas. Louis is very different. He came from a very academic family. His father was a professor at Dartmouth College, for instance, and he went to Dartmouth and then graduated from there and went on to graduate school at Harvard. And so he was very different, but I just knew he was really a good person. And also I knew he was a really intelligent person, whereas my earlier experience with dating and all that was all fun, you know. So I thought, well, I'm 24 now, and also I've had this other experience. I really better settle down and do something really worthwhile. So plus the fact that we did fall in love, so there was that. And at that time, he said, oh, was always interested in music as well. And since I was at Our Lady of the Lake, we were we had a concert at the local symphony hall, which was singing the Beethoven Ninth. And I was in the women's chorus and he was in the male chorus. So we had, some real deep interest, similar deep interest.
Yeah.
So that plus the fact that I had never been east before that. So during that period, I came up to Cambridge, and I just looked at everything and I thought, everything looks so old. The buildings, everything looks so old. It was quite an experience. In any case, we really had a good time. We liked it. We met other couples that were also married during graduate school. And I guess the major thing that happened was that because he got this traveling fellowship and we had this 7-month-old, I don't think many people would have traveled around the world with a 7-month-old.
Yeah.
But my mother, who was very optimistic, outgoing, said, oh, you can do it, no problem. And of course, what did I know? So we took this kid around the world. We started out in Hong Kong, Japan, India, the Middle East, then Europe. It was a really wonderful experience. In fact, we have a picture of Chris, our oldest one, standing. I don't know if you've ever heard of the artist Gaudi, the Spanish artist Gaudi. And we were in Barcelona, and he was very well known, and he did a whole ceramic bench in this garden. And so Chris is standing there, not even a year old, and his picture's there. And not too long ago, he went back and got another picture, and now he's 60 years old. So it's kind of fun to relive some of these things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sure. So you moved to Cambridge to work for the Harvard Press. What did this job entail? And what ended up leading you to this job with the Harvard Press, especially since you majored in music education in college?
And that did nothing. I mean, I just worked as a secretary, nothing major in any way. And I made friends there, which was fun. And then once I had Chris, of course, I had to stop working. So that was that. I didn't work there. I don't think maybe a year, not even. Yeah. And then as I said, we had a little money. So we decided with his fellowship and with the little money we had, we were able to go around the world. Yeah. And that really, I think, also was a major impetus in our life. We traveled, we saw different people, different countries, different, it was very, very opening to our knowledge of the world.
Yeah, so you mentioned a couple, but what were all the places that you visited on this fellowship and what did you all see? Any highlights?
Well, India was really the most sobering incident for me, in the sense that the people there were so poor. And they were, you would see, I walked into the bathroom in it was a public bathroom, and there would be people lying on the floor with shrouds over their heads. They had no place else to sleep. And that was, very distressing for me to see that. And then Loie wanted to see all these buildings, so we hired a car and traveled to different sites that he was architecturally interested in. And so a lot of young children would come up to the car and look peer in the window at us. I should also go back. When we first started to travel the world, we spent 3 months in Japan, and I had a young Japanese woman help me with Chris. And I could go shopping and cook, and we lived in a Japanese tea pavilion house, which is, the soji siding, and you open up and you looked out, and the garden was beautiful, and there would be several gardeners out there trimming the trees. It all looked so natural, but it was all taken care of, you know. And then friends would come over. We took baths in this huge bamboo, what they called a furo tub, and had a sort of a fire to cook on. And this young woman who helped me take care of Chris was very progressive in her ideas. She thought that everything that the Japanese were doing was very feudal, although she was herself Japanese, that she was a young Japanese. So she had a lot of complaints. But we were very interested and made some very good Japanese friends. We also went and visited in Burma. Our friends, actually a classmate of Loie's, who got a Fulbright to Burma, and they were living in a Burmese style house, which is a square donut with a garden in the center. And you could just open up the side of the house and be on the outside. And we slept on the floor, the deck of this square house, and you looked up in the morning and you could see the sky. And that, well, we still are friends. They're living in South Carolina right now, so we still talk to them. Yeah. Oh, and I remember in Japan, our friends were so generous. They gave me some jewelry. And while I was in Burma, because our friends had been so kind to us, I gave her some of my jewelry. And when you enter a country like Burma, they have a lot of precious and semi-precious stones. So you have to write down everything that you're bringing into the country. When I was leaving the country, I was missing a few things. So the customs officer gave me the Dickens, because he said I didn't have everything. I wasn't leaving with everything that I came with. So that was an interesting experience. Yeah, Spain, went to Venice. Venice was wonderful, but Venice in the winter, don't go in the winter. It was freezing cold. And you walk through these little streets and the wind would be blowing. It was just, it was really something. But, and then I guess we ended up in Europe. So not so much. We didn't spend a long time in England, um, as I remember. So we were anxious to get back. We've been gone for 7 months with this baby, and we were tired, as you can imagine.
What was this whole journey like with a child coming traveling with you everywhere?
It was, well, it wasn't easy because there weren't any Pampers in those days. So I had to do his diapers wherever I was. And we had to be sure that he had good food, and we ate a lot of bananas, and fortunately we had powdered milk from Hong Kong, and we were able to boil water to make the milk. Uh, Eat bananas, something you could feel that you knew was safe. Um, so you learn how to survive in those conditions. Being very careful with especially with the baby, because you don't want him to get sick and anything. Actually, he did finally he got a cold in Spain, and the doctor came to the came to the hotel and chastised me because he was sick. Anyway, he survived. He's now 60, about to be 63 years old, so I can't.
So you ended up moving and settling in New York City. What made you end up choose this city?
Okay. We didn't really want to live in New York. But in those days, it was the early 60s and there was kind of a depression. So Loie tried to find a job, and his family friend, Ian Pei, hired him. So that's how we ended up there. And when we first moved to New York, we lived in Brooklyn Heights, where our second child was born. And we lived there for a while. Loie did work. At that time he was working very hard because I.M. Pei's business was flourishing, and so he would often work, way into the night. So pretty much, but we made close friends that we still have in Brooklyn Heights, and we lived in a brownstone, one floor of a brownstone. And then a friend of ours found us this apartment up where we are still living in New York on what we consider the Upper West Side. We're at 99th and Riverside. And it's a very large apartment with three bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, maid's room, kitchen, living. So we stayed here because we were in something called a rent control, which meant you paid very low rent. And we've been here for over almost 60 years now. And we've watched this whole area change. When we first moved here, it was full of drug addicts and alcoholics on the street. But we survived those times, and now it's pretty much gentrified.
What was your experience like in raising 3 children and balancing everything?
Yeah, it was wonderful, actually. We were very lucky. We had a friend who was in the administration of something called a private school, field ethical culture, run by the ethical culture organization. So our children went to elementary school there. And oh, I thought she was coming to see you. Elementary school there, and we were able to keep our children in this school all the way through high school, where they all went to Dartmouth after that. And raising children in New York was pretty challenging because, as you can imagine, um, they had to go by bus or subway. We had a car, but it wasn't something you did. In other places, you drive to school or whatever, but not in the city. And they got a very good education in the lower school. Actually, I was dyslexic, which also made school hard for me. And our second son, Leighton, who's a doctor and heads the rehab clinic at NIH, was also very dyslexic because at that time they knew what dyslexia was and they were able to help him, learn how to manage it. So, I mean, he went through obviously very stringent education, so he made it through. And our daughter also, she was 5 years younger. She's just now turned 55. And unfortunately, she has a hereditary eye problem. My husband, Lo Yi's mother, became blind and deaf by the age of 60. And although my daughter is working in finance, she also is losing her eyesight. So it's becoming a critical problem for her now. She has to make decisions of what to do. But they've all been great kids. We just had a big family gathering at Lake Champlain, where our daughter-in-law, Leighton's wife, his family has had the property there for many, many years, generations, as a matter of fact. So that was wonderful. Yeah. I think it was great to be able to bring up your children in the city because there's so many advantages, museums, education, etc. Whereas growing up in some other area where you lack this broad spectrum of things you can do and learn is quite different.
Yeah, so my next series of questions are about Chinese cooking. So you enrolled in the China Institute to learn about Chinese cooking and
Oh, yes. Well, I had always cooked a lot. And that's what, was good about having children and being able to be home and cook for them, etc. So Leighton, the second child, said to me one day, and he was only about 9 or 10, and he said, "Mom, what are you going to do when we're all gone?" I mean, this kid has always thought outside of the box, so to speak. And I thought, well, I really like to cook. And so maybe I'll go to China Institute and enroll. So that's where I met Florence Lin, who became a very dear friend. And we collaborated and worked together for many years. And she died a few years ago, but she was like a mother to me. And so she brought me into China Institute and I became president of the Women's Association there. And that's how I got on the board. And then from the board, I stayed on the board and until I left, which was quite a few years ago. But that was a wonderful experience because, and as I said, I think I mentioned that during my time of cooking, teaching cooking, the Children's High School, Fieldston at the time, asked me to donate a class, which I did. And the person who bought the class was kosher. And I, at that time, knew nothing. I had heard of kosher, but I didn't know what it meant. And so she was the person who bought it really wanted to learn Chinese cooking. And she said, I'll tell you about the dietary laws. So that's how I learned about that. And was able to transfer that and teach that through the 92nd Street Y, which is a Jewish organization. And I'm taught at a synagogue. It was quite an, I decided, this is how eventually I decided to give up kosher teaching, because the young people became so orthodox that they wouldn't eat with their parents. In other words, they had to separate the meals. And so I said, and also became so difficult because they were so orthodox to teach them, that I decided I didn't want to do it anymore. So that sort of ended my teaching career. But then I became involved in something called the New York Women's Foundation, which is quite well known. And I think New York Women's Foundation is one of the most successful fundraising women's organization in the country. And at that time, it was just starting. It was in the 90s. And meanwhile, I did write this cookbook, which also was good for me to have done, about kosher Chinese, because I think I'm the only Chinese who's ever written about kosher cooking. And so that's kind of interesting. Then this women's organization really raises money to help women-led organizations for women. And as I said, I think they're one of the more successful New York women's organizations in the country. I think there are a number of them. But they hold an annual breakfast, which thousands of people attend. And they raise millions of dollars. And during the early period, I became very involved, was the head of the board for a while. And because at that time, it wasn't so large or so organized. Anyway, that's sort of my life. And now I've just been, now that I'm in my 80s, close to 90, I'm sort of taking it easy. Just enjoying visiting and traveling. Not so much during pandemic though, yeah.
Were there any favorite recipes that you
I
had?
can't hear you, I'm sorry.
Oh, you're good. Were there any favorite recipes that you've had and that you really enjoyed making?
I guess the soy sauce chicken recipe is a favorite one. And I will send it to you. I'll also send you a book because I have some extra ones. I just haven't gotten around to it, but I will do that. The soy sauce recipe is easy and it really is delicious. That's one that if you have the right ingredients, anybody can do. It doesn't require a lot of preparation, like cutting it up and so forth. Except after it's cooked, you should cut it up. But it's actually in my cookbook, I'm pretty sure. And I can't, stir fry. I've taken to stir frying kale with red onion, which is pretty good. A little soy sauce, a little salt and pepper. Yeah. So maybe I can write those up and send them to you. Do you have, I guess you gave me an address?
Yeah, I can send you more information after the interview.
I can't hear you.
I can forward you more information after the
Okay, that would be good, yes.
So you also mentioned Florence Lynn. Um, what did you learn as like her assistant or through her mentorship?
I learned how to teach. She didn't speak English perfectly by any means, but she always got her idea across. And she was a very outgoing, a little bit like my mother in the sense that people just gravitated towards her, you know. She could, I have all her cookbooks. She's written many. Uh, she's wrote a one dish cookbook. She wrote a complete book of noodles and dumplings and breads. I'm just looking up on my shelf all these cookbooks that she's written. And one of the things that I learned from her is how careful she is in method of teaching. And she makes sure you understand what she's trying to portray, you know. I got a vegetarian cookbook for her. And of course, her regional cookbook is, I think you can't even get it today on Amazon. It's probably like $80 for the book. It's that well known and that well revered. She also did things for Time Magazine and New York. She did cooking, the Chinese cooking of China for Life magazine. And she was just very outgoing. I actually have her whole, she also is a third daughter. This is her biography of, and I don't know if you're interested in having that in the, it's not, it's, you know, it has to be collated and stuff.
Yeah, we would be happy to.
What? I'm
We
sorry.
would be happy to have that in the archive as well if you
Yeah,
wanted to
oh yeah.
list that.
Yeah, because I think as a Chinese, she was very well known. There's Grace Chu, who was well known, but not, and Grace would tell you, she taught Chinese cooking too, but she's not a good cook.
Yeah.
She said that herself. It's so interesting.
So you also mentioned that you taught cooking as well. What was that experience like?
Well, it was a very broadening experience because you met all different kinds of people, and also, especially teaching the kosher, because people who are kosher are very, how shall I say, are very careful. They stick to their rules. And so everybody has an opinion. And there were lots of arguments during these classes about what was the best way to defeather a duck. Kind of interesting, huh? Do you use pin, you know, can you take the pin feathers off? There were certain rules. For instance, normally you dunk a fowl in boiling water and then defeather it. You're not allowed to do that in kosher. So, you know, so the defeathering is a lot more laborious. You know, and people, I think because when you're cooking, people are so relaxed. They open up and they tell you things that they don't ordinarily talk about, especially when it has to do with their religion or whatever, you know. That's what I found. So it was a very broadening experience. Yeah. Yeah, it was fun.
Yeah. So then what motivated you to also then publish your own cookbook?
Oh, well, because as I gave this class, and this woman uh, told me she would teach me about Chinese cooking. Actually, it was Florence who said, Millie, you've got to do this. Because I'm very shy. I actually am quite shy. And I don't feel, like I can be an authority on anything. And she just was at me and at me. She said, you have to do it. You have to do it. So I finally did. And she was very sweet about it. She really goaded me into it, so to speak. Yeah. So it was Florence, my mentor, a wonderful woman. I really miss her.
Yeah. Um, you also mentioned that you were the president of the New York Women's Foundation from
Uh-huh.
1997 to 1999.
Uh-huh.
Can you tell me more about how you came into this position and what you liked about it?
Okay. What was interesting was that I was in a cab with my friend Polly Guth, and their family owned the Corning Glassware. Uh, so she had been involved with the Women's Foundation for a while. And because I worked with her husband at China Institute, he was also on the board of China Institute. So we were kind of close. She said, Millie, you should join the New York Women's Foundation. And I said, oh, I don't know if I want to do that. I was not, I didn't promote myself in any way like that. And so finally, said, okay, well, I'll join. And what I did was I joined the album. They did an annual album. So I joined that small group and I became very friendly and good friends with the people that were working on that. And that led me in those days, there was not a lot of staff at the foundation. So you were very, close to the executive director. And the executive director said to me, Millie, you should be president of the board. And, it wasn't something that I went out to try to do. Somebody got me into it. And so therefore I did it. And that was pretty much my whole life. I mean, I didn't seek to do, I wasn't like ambitious, so to speak, to do this or do that. But when the opportunity presented itself, I stepped into it. I mean, so that was very interesting for me. And I liked it because at that time, we would travel by subway or whatever to go to these different women's organizations through the boroughs as well as Manhattan. So you had to go way out and you learned what other women were doing in their communities. So that, and also I was learning more about the Asian community in New York City because of it. So that's what my experience was. And I did that for a long time. And, I, after a while, other people took over as well. So, you go, you do what you can when you can do it, and then you ease out because of other people coming in who have actually, are good and have more energy, etc. Yeah.
Yeah,
I
so
don't know if that explains it.
that was perfect. Yeah, so in New York, during COVID and amidst the escalated anti-Asian environment, do you know of anyone who's been targeted or yourself or anything like that?
Okay. I don't know anybody personally, but I have a hair cutter who's Japanese, and she comes to my house. She's young. She's about maybe 15, 20 years younger than I am. and she is frightened. She won't, and I don't take the subway anymore, Chelsea. Because most of the incidences happen in public transportation, I think, or when you're out on the street in the middle of the city. So she's bought herself a motorbike and she travels around that way. So that nothing has actually happened to her, but I think she's felt, kind of uncomfortable at different times. And we're living on the Upper West Side, so very close to Columbia University. And it's a very sort of older people, moderate income. So I think it's a very safe area compared to a lot of different places in the city. So I don't have any problem walking around.
I see. So going back to kind of your children, you mentioned that your eldest child, Chris, is an architect. Leighton is a doctor, and Laisha is the head of operations at a family investment management firm. So they all came out to be pretty successful. Were there any values that you instilled in your children that led to these outcomes?
Oh, yeah, I think so. We just were very good, loving parents. I remember Leighton was in something at school and he was some sort of, I don't know, was on stage or something. And he said, I don't think I did so well. Mom, I'm really worried. I said, Leighton, whatever you did, if you did your best, I just remember this because I think it really made an impression on him. Whatever you do your best, and we aren't going to be critical of it. That's one thing, yeah. And we always praised them, but we also, if they did something wrong, they knew it, and they got chastised for it if necessary. Our daughter, as I said, has this eye problem. So she's going through a critical period right now, what she should do, because her firm has just been sold to a bigger firm, and she doesn't know whether she wants to or can actually transfer into that. So it's a big decision for her. And she's unmarried, doesn't want to get married, So, but both our sons have very good relationships. They both are married to Caucasian. The oldest one's married to a young woman he met in graduate school, who by happenstance was born in San Antonio. Her parents knew my parents, and we didn't know this until after they fell in love. It wasn't like, it was predestined or anything like that. It was just a happenstance, which is really unusual, I think. And Leighton is married to a physical therapist whom he met when he was interning for medicine in Seattle. And they lived in Seattle for a while. And then he got this job at NIH and they moved to Bethesda. They've been there ever since. Yeah. And we have 3 adopted granddaughters, all from China. And 1 biological grandson who's missing a chromosome. So he has a problem, but he's the most lovable, empathetic kid you'll ever want to meet. So we have a very wonderful family. I'm very, very lucky. Yeah. And they care about each other and they care about us, So What, you can't ask for more.
What would you say are the most important aspects of raising children?
I think being very forthright, very honest. You know, if something is wrong, say so. If they can be praised, praise them. And I think in general, just accepting them for who they are, you know. I wouldn't, we didn't say you have to go to, in fact, Leighton's the first doctor in the whole family. We didn't, they chose what they want. They consulted with us. I remember after college, he was really in a quandary of what to do. And so he talked about it, you know, what should he do? And then he finally decided on medicine. There were nobody in the family was a doctor, so, you know, couldn't advise him about that. Chris always wanted to be an architect, and he did a lot of traveling in his early days. He tried to go to, he was going to be a lawyer, and he interned for a company, a diamond company, and he thought that was the worst possible worst possible thing he could do as a profession, because it was so boring. Anyway, you know, and our daughter has always been good at figures, and she doesn't like to make decisions, and she also doesn't like change. So she finds something that's her niche and she just stays there. And she's wonderful. She's the best auntie that any niece or nephew could ever want. She doesn't have her own children, but they all love her. So and she loves them. And she's got nieces that will call her up. They're in college now, and they call her up, and she spends hours on the phone with them. I think, you know, it's unusual, I think.
So finally, do you kind of have a vision?
I'm sorry, I can't hear you at all.
Do you have a vision of how you want to kind of lead the next couple of years? You said take it slow, and yeah.
It's on our minds a lot. And we've looked at retirement homes, and we've looked at different places. We're in a very good spot up here. There are many older people in the Upper West Side of New York. So we've joined something, and Lo Yi is particularly, now that he's retired, particularly interested and active in it. It's called Bloomingdale's Aging in Place. And so he has joined it. He's started a tennis group. He's on their Zoom tech squad. He runs that. You know, so it's really been terrific for him. He's much more active in it than I am. I have a lot of personal friends that I see and keep up with. I'm not so interested in meeting a lot of different people and doing a lot of different things, although we do that. And we're traveling more now, which is, now that COVID is, you know, a little bit easier, but it doesn't sound like we can do that again so much. So recently we've been traveling a lot. For instance, in the last few months, we've been to Fire Island to visit friends. And then we went to, we went back to the Berkshires. We had a house during this period, which also helped with bringing up the children. I failed to mention that. Early on, when the boys were about 7, 8, we bought a place in the Berkshires house that was right across from the Housatonic River. And our boys fell in love with fishing because they would go down to the river and see all these fish in the river. And they very early on would be making their own lures and their own blah, blah, blah. And so we had this house for many years, sold it a year or so ago. But during this period, I would spend the whole summer in the country with them. That's also helped bringing up the children because they learned to play tennis. And we had close friends. They weren't necessarily Chinese, but a lot of close friends that we had that they were able to play with. So they got out of the city for the summer, which helped a lot because otherwise it'd be very confining. And Loie would work stay here during the week and then come up for the weekends. For many years, we did that. And then we expanded the house and had many big parties there. It was wonderful. Yeah. I have actually pictures of the house. I don't know if you're interested in any of stuff like that.
Of course, yeah. Feel free to send them over through email after the interview, and we will put them
Okay.
in the archive. Yeah.
And we just our oldest son, his wife, and one of their daughters, and another of our granddaughters, they just took pictures of jumping off this cliff into the water. I don't know if you're interested in stuff like that.
Yeah, of course, anything. Yeah. Yeah, well, that is all of my questions. Is there anything that I might have missed?
I don't think so. I mean, I can't think of anything else.
Well, if there is anything, you can always feel free to email us
Okay.
and attach anything else, and we will put it in the file.
Are you interested in Florence?
Yes, for sure.
Okay, we can do that. The other person